So welcome everybody to our first class of the 2022 Pasture Management series. We're going to be taking this class once a month. It's going to be on the fourth Wednesday. We are going to take a break in December and January, but everything else we'll try to have a class about every month on the fourth Wednesday. There is a few that are on a few different days because of the way holidays kind of fall. But this is hopefully a class that's in a series that provides a lot of use for you to be able to try to be ahead of things along the way. I know it's such a challenging time to try to figure out how to raise grass and how to manage pastures, especially when you get a year that's like this past where we had a really tough summer. So we're going to talk about things, what we're seeing today, as well as what we can be looking forward to over the next month before the next meeting. So as we begin, we're starting to talk about August to give you an idea of where we're going. This is kind of the agenda we have. We'll spend a few minutes talking about what we're seeing out in the fields and pastures right now. We're going to talk about what we expect to be doing over the next month. And then we'll kind of conclude with a bunch of questions that you guys may have. And we'll do our best to keep it around a 30-minute session so that we don't get too overwhelmed with what we're talking about. But this will be available for recording if you're interested. So many of you going around looking at all different types of pastures over the past month or so, and even looking at some today. These are a lot of the things, and you're probably seeing a lot of different situations that I'm seeing and highlighted right here. Maybe not to the extreme of the distressed fescue that you're seeing on the left-hand side, but that's an indication of some things that our friends in the West and the Southwest are starting to experience. They have some true extreme drought situations where their fescue may look exactly like that ground that you have right there. Johnson grass, it was one of those things. It was kind of holding off for most of the summer. We weren't getting really any rains at all. But now that we're starting getting a little moisture in the ground, we're starting to see that really explode and really start to take over a lot of our pastures. For those pastures that may have a heavy traffic, may have lots of grazing going on, whether it's cattle or horses, you may not see near as much of the Johnson grass. You'll see a lot more what that looks like kind of sporadic grass. That's where we've seen overgrazing, and that's really exemplified by this year because we had such extreme heat and drought for much of June and most of July. And so if you had any type of overgrazing, overpressure, then you started to see a lot of your grass almost just disappear, which that looks more like a situation you might see coming out of winter. But starting to see that situation in summer is a little extreme because typically you would see some crabgrass like you see in the fourth picture. You'd see crabgrass starting to appear in some of those situations. But that's certainly the case where you lost some of your main cool season forage like fescue, but you're not replacing it necessarily with crabgrass. And so the situation now is for those people around the Middle Tennessee area, we're starting to see more and more heavy crabgrass starting to come in, filling in some of those gaps if you've been receiving some of those rains. Some of the crabgrass just never really came on, or because of lack of grazing, it even got grazed out. But that's something we're starting to see a little bit more today. And one on the far right, we've made a couple of mentions about this earlier in the year. But this is what we're starting to see, especially in those areas that it's lightly shaded. You've still got plenty of sunlight penetrating. A lot of times you'll see it in the transition between the woods and the sunlight and the grass. You're going to see perilla mint. Perilla mint is a highly toxic plant to horses, cattle, sheep, goats, just about everything that's grazing out there. It's highly toxic. Good news is it's fairly has a very, very poor taste to it. So most animals tend to leave it alone. Our big concern earlier this summer was that it was pretty dry. And so if you did not have a lot of grass like you see in the left-hand picture or the middle picture, then you started to see animals maybe perusing and starting to look at plants they would typically not eat. So Perilla mint is in full bloom. It looks exactly like that plant right now that you're seeing on the right-hand side. It's one of those plants I like to keep my eye on. If you do see it in the pasture, it is highly toxic. Horses will not bother it unless really forced to maintain their survival. But one thing that you can look at potentially doing is you'll see opportunities for treatment of it. One thing I would caution everybody about is when you treat Perilla mint at this size and scope of weed, that the only time that it actually puts off a very flavorful taste, it actually puts off a very sweet aroma taste, is when it's in the dying stress mode. So if you would to spray this, it would all of a sudden start wilting and then put off a very desirable taste. And that's when you would actually see a lot of animals desire that plant and actually start to consume it. So for the most part, knock it down, pull it out of the field if you want. We're kind of past treatment of it. So most animals are like I said, are going to leave it alone, but that might be an opportunity to get rid of that one. Obstacles I'm seeing as we start to go into what we're looking to, which is the fall and potentially some options to be able to reseed or rehab some of our pastures. Soil moisture is so key at this time. And a lot of people ask me, when do we start to try to do any type of reseeding or rehabbing? And they always want a date about when it starts. And it's more about soil moisture. So right now we have a little bit of moisture, but there's still big pockets all around the Middle Tennessee area that still do not have much soil moisture. You might see a little bit on top, but you get a deeper down into the ground, you're not seeing a lot of soil moisture. And remember, when you're planting a seed, it's only going down about ½ an inch into the ground. So when you still have really warm days, it dries out on the top ½ inch pretty quick. So you have to have a lot of consistent moisture and a lot of cooler days. Summer competition, like we said, it's a little bit later, but a lot of these summer grasses are really starting to come on. And so what they provide is competition. So for any type of reseeding we may be looking to do, they're still thriving during this time when it's just a little bit of moisture and it's still 85, 90 degrees that we're seeing. That's a lot of competition for some of our young seedlings starting to go. Heat is obviously another one. We just talked about it, soil moisture and the competition. It's a struggle. Obviously, it warms up and our grass can grow pretty fast if we're planting something, but it also can dry out pretty fast, and a lot of 90-degree weather, which we typically still see in a lot of September, would still play a pretty big role in the struggle for some of our new seedlings trying to grow. Hay supply, the reason why I put hay supply on here is a lot of times when we're starting to think about doing some renovations or things this fall, we talk about being able to pull animals off and feed hay and a little bit earlier so that our plants have a chance to grow. Well, hay supply is pretty short compared to previous years. We hope we'll have a fairly mild winter, but you just don't know. But with hay supply being drastically decreased in Tennessee, as well as across the West, that may provide some challenges for us as we move forward. And just competition for resources. And so there's only so much resources that are available in the soil. And so when you have other weeds and other things going on, they can provide a lot of competition for the seedlings that you're actively trying to grow. So looking forward, these are some of the things that I want to have us be looking forward over the next month before our next meeting. Some things that we want to be talking about and preparing to do, and some decisions that we're going to try to make along the way, and some tools that we can use to help with those decisions and help set us up for success as we move forward through the year. So we'll talk about spring versus fall seeding. And when we talk about that, that is more geared towards cool season forages. We'll talk a little bit later in the new year in 2023, we'll start talking about warm season seeding. But for the most part, we're talking about cool season grasses like fescue, orchard grass, depending on where you're seeding. We're going to talk about, what do you do? How do you make those decisions? Do you not do anything? Do you reseed? Do you completely restart everything? Some decision factors in that. We'll look at spraying versus clipping or mowing, or do we do both, or baling? Which decisions do we make in some of those? So some of those things can all be done prior to us being ready to plant. Looking at soil testing and as one of the valuable tools, and making and farm visits as a unrealized opportunity to get specific information for your farm. So as we go into it, we have to look at, do we plant in the spring or versus the fall? Naturally, I think it feels like when we see spring, we think fresh, new life. We have great weather. There's moisture in the ground. It just feels like the right time to be planting, especially cool season forages like fescue, orchard grass, rye, some of those things like that. But in Tennessee, it's by far the second one. I rate it 1 out of 6 as far as things that I would recommend doing when it comes to reseeding. So if you look at 2020 and 2021, even a little bit in 2019, they were ideal climate years, I believe. And so that gave us the opportunity to potentially even do a little bit of spring seeding, but still our investment will not reap near the benefits as a fall seeding will do. This year absolutely personified that, and I would rate it a 0 out of 6. If you put some seed in the ground this spring, most likely you lost about that entire stand of grass. There's just too many opportunities, and we'll talk about that as we go through spring. But we will more talk about the benefits of fall being the perfect opportunity to do some reseeding, replanting. There's less competition. We talk about some of the spring grasses starting to really take off by the time we start to get our fescue in the ground. So there's a little bit less competition in the fall. We're going to have the warm season grasses. Once we get past that initial warm season, we get into that first frost and probably a little bit more of a warm up again in early November. A lot of the warm season grasses have stopped, so we have less competition. For spraying wise, we don't necessarily need to, if we're going to do some herbicide treatments, we can get by with not doing one of those in the fall and still be able to come back in late winter or early spring and still control some of those cool season weeds. And so that allows us then to do a lot more reseeding versus trying to control the weeds. One of the best things that I like is you get 2 rainy seasons. You're going to get kind of a fall rainy season, and you're going to get a winter rainy season. So that's going to give your grass plenty of opportunity to get good moisture, some good sunlight, to be able to get going and establish a really great root system before that summer heat of next summer of next year in 2023. Before that really comes on, your root system has a really good opportunity to establish those roots and be able to reach that water supply whenever it goes dry and the spigot turns off. And one of the final ones I like is the rest period. The rest period being the period that you're able to pull animals potentially off those pastures to allow that grass to really get up and start going. Because during the fall, a lot of times that transitions into the winter. And during that winter time, grass is not growing. And so one of the main things that we're gonna have to do is we're gonna be feeding hay. So when you start talking about feeding hay, if you'll notice, most of the horses will spend most of their time around their pasture, around the hay ring most of the winter where the feed is at. And so they don't really navigate too far away from that. And so they don't need near as much space as they would grazing on our entire pasture. So you can actually reduce the amount of space down for them, which opens up more space for your pastures to be able to rest. So saying all those things, I always talk about, I plant all year long for fall being my planting year. Hopefully everything works out and we get some moisture, we get some cooler days. And so that will allow us to do the planting. Every once in a while, Mother Nature won't cooperate and she'll be hot and dry all through the fall. And we just have to chalk that one up to her victory, and we'll try again next year. That may challenge us doing some replanting in the spring. But that's the point of this session right here, and these sessions moving forward, is we're always kind of looking at what are we seeing, and then what should we be planning on it and adapting to. So by participating in this, I think you'll be well ahead. So as we go into this decision-making process, this is what each of you can be doing as you start to go through this next month. You can start looking at how do I evaluate my pasture, and then what does that mean? What do I need to be doing? And so there's really three options that I look at. There's the nothing needs to be done, and that is, to me, an extreme situation on one end or the other. The extreme situation being, you have a great stand of grass. You don't need to be doing any type of really renovation. You don't. The stand is nice and thick. You're able to manage it quite well. You may not have been overgrazing. You might have had some opportunities to be able to put a little fertilizer on it to keep the stand nice and thick. You might have been fortunate enough to get a few rains here and there that allowed that grass to survive, or at least maintain as it went through that hot part of the summer. But overgrazing being one of the number one things, just looking at different pastures where one may be a hayfield and the other might be a pasture, and you look at the difference between one that had constant pressure on it all summer long and one that was left alone during the hottest, driest parts. It's kind of amazing looking at the stands of grass. So looking at doing nothing, you have a good stand. You might need to do a little bit of weed control, as far as just trying to control some of those broadleaf weeds, trying to keep them down. You may have some warm season grasses in there, and that's okay. And the other option, when I look at the other extreme, when you say I'm going to do nothing, is maybe you don't have the option of really being able to let your pasture rest if you reseed it. And so that's one of the biggest keys, if you are going to reseed, is it just has to have the ability to rest. And when I say rest, it means it needs to have the ability to not have any animal pressure on it, because our grass is very susceptible and very liable to get destroyed or lost if you put any type of pressure on it. And we can start talking about the ability, but I always use the theory that 2 days is better than 1 day, 2 weeks is better than 1 week, 2 months is better than a month, on down the road. So the more rest you can give that pasture, the better chance you have for that grass to get going. If you don't have the option, sometimes it's just not worth, it's a kind of a hope and a prayer to throw seed out there if you immediately put an animal back on there, because it just won't have the opportunity to really get it started and get going. So the do nothing is kind of the extreme of it's either really good or it's so bad that we really just, we need to have a different plan versus trying to constantly reseed and hope to maintain a really nice pasture. Doesn't mean we can't have a good functional pasture that takes advantage of the seasonal grasses, but maybe not what we think of as an ideal pasture in our mind, or somebody may tell us about. The second one where we're looking at is reseeding. And that's something where you maybe have less than 80% of your stand. I always look at Tennessee. It's always a great opportunity. Most of the time, if you have the ability to plan on reseeding every year, then take advantage of that opportunity. Fescue is able to survive. And I say fescue most of the time because that's mostly what most of our pastures are going to be. Obviously, if you've got some brood mares, and we'll talk about that down the line, that's not the situation for you. But fescue is not really designed to live here completely, so it does struggle. So it's always got pressure on it, and it's kind of, the clock has started when you start talking about how long it's going to live. So anytime we can do some constant renovation, that's well worth it. Weed control might be our second priority. I don't necessarily recommend trying to control weeds once you've got a young seedling started. So if you've got relatively small amounts of weeds, and that you can control those later on in the year or early in the next year, that might be a priority. So we won't have to worry about weed control as much. We can still focus in on reseeding. If you have cool season grasses, this is a good like I said, this is the time to be able to do this. We want to reseed. And then like we mentioned previously, you need to have the ability to rest your pastures from any type of activity on it, whether it's tractors driving across it or it's animals grazing on it. You need to have that ability to let them rest. They just won't survive. And if you ask me functionally, what is the ideal place? We can start with ideal and always work backwards. But if you plant during the middle of the fall, I would say if you could let it go till early to mid-spring, that's ideal. But we can also obviously work around each situation that may be there. So where we get to restart, that's kind of a total renovation. Your stand is less than maybe 30% of your ideal grass. If you're trying to get back to an ideal pasture, where you have a lot more of a one type of grass going on, weed control is needed. You may be completely overrun with weeds, and so you have little grass, lots of weeds. You may have lots of warm season grasses that don't work for your operation. You're looking for potentially some good spring and fall grasses, along with having a decent grass during the summer. And so there's not really anything worth saving. You really need to go through a total control and total renovation. Once again, you have to be able to rest your pasture. So there's three options you can kind of look at as you start to make that assessment of what works for your pasture. Then you start to go as, how do we start to prepare some of that? Do you start to, do you spray it? Do you clip it, mow it, or bale it, or do you do both? And so considerations to look at are, do you have a lot of broadleaf weeds? If you have a lot of broadleaf weeds, mowing you're just kind of restarting that process. So if you really want to get ahead, the key to a really thick stand of grass pasture is you can eliminate a lot of weeds with a very thick stand. But to really get ahead, herbicide treatment of those weeds is really your best and only option. Clipping works, but you don't necessarily ever get to that further plateau where you're looking for a really thick stand. So if your grass is grazed down, that might be where you can also spray. You don't necessarily need to clip. If you have mainly cool season grasses, you may not need to. They're typically going to be a little thinner right now. They're not going to be near as thick, and they grow in the clumping form. And so when you talk about the clump, so when you have one clump of grass versus a warm season grass, which sends kind of runners all across the ground and is a very low profile grass. And so it can kind of suffocate the entire surface with some of those warm season, but cool season tends to grow in clumps. And so whenever you lose a clump of grass, it opens up immediately. And so the ground is bare and able to go. So the other thing is, if you're doing a total redo, that's where you're going to spray and terminate everything at one time. When you look at clipping and baling, this is an opportunity. This is where you maybe have very few weeds, and so you really don't need to do a whole lot going on. If you have heavy warm season grasses, you're going to have to probably clip that down, and I recommend doing that in stages, because what you don't want to happen is when you go through and clip, you leave huge chunks of dead decaying matter on top. And so that matter starts to decay. And when you try to plant a seed in it, that it will actually kind of rot away. So you may have to go through and clip. And then you look at, if you have really tall cool season grass, so you have a lot of grass that maybe has not been grazed and it's really tall. So you need to be able to cut that down so that you can expose that ground to some of those new seedlings so they can have a lot of sunlight, because if they're shaded out by these other grasses, they won't be able to grow. So the extreme option is baling. That's one of actually the best options that I recommend for clearing the ground. Go ahead and bale off and clip as close as you can to the ground, bale off some of that grass, and then that will open up a lot of areas for that dirt to be exposed and that grass to be planted in that dirt. And then you look at both. This is probably the combination. Obviously, it's like the porridge. It's hot, too cold, or it's in the middle. This is in the middle. It's a combination of multiple things. And I tend to think this is usually the best option, because there's not necessarily one extreme or the other. We have some broadleaf weeds, so that's where we might look at trying to treat with those with some selective herbicide that treats just broadleaf weeds. We have some heavy warm season grasses. So we're going to look at, okay, we need to go ahead and control those. by either clipping them or baling them. We have to do something to open up that dirt surface for that seed to get planted into. We have some tall, cool season grasses, and we have some mature weeds that we may need to cut down those mature weeds, because a lot of times herbicides will not work when you have really tall mature weeds. So you can either clip them down and leave them be, and so hopefully they'll start much slower, and that gives your grass a chance to get started. Or if you want to actually terminate those weeds, clip them down and then let them grow a little bit, and then you can start to work on treating them with spraying with a herbicide. Those are 3 options, and we'll look at a timeline that kind of spreads these out, and hopefully that will help you as we go along here. Looking at soil testing, here's one of the most important key aspects that I think you can really get involved in is soil testing. And we say it here and time again, you've probably heard it if you've gone through any type of presentation from Extension or anything, but the science shows it time and time again. And this is based on a pasture that if you did nothing to this pasture other than apply the right amount of lime, and we'll go into the science of this as we go throughout this whole course. If you look at just applying lime, phosphorus, which is P, and K, which is potassium, if you just apply the phosphorus and potassium, you see there's a decent growth in the grass, and the weeds start to go downhill. We see our clover, which is also a good indicator of nitrogen, starts to go up. This is where if you start to put, and then it kind of plateaus, this is where if you start to apply some lime, it starts to really take off. And then if you apply any type of fertilizer on top of that, it really takes off. And so as you can see is as the grass takes off, they suppress some of the weeds. Now you're going to suppress some of the clover too, but the overall benefit is the grass is taking off. The number one thing is having the right environment. And so that's what we're trying to do by putting nitrogen, potassium, and a lime on. So this is the best dollar investment you're ever going to make in a $20 test. So I kind of think of it as like your doctor. A lot of times you go in for a checkup, your doctor's going to look at you, he's going to assess, he's going to do a visual assessment, but almost every time he's going to send you down for blood work in the end, because he can't tell exactly what's going on the inside. He has an idea based on his visual assessment, but he really can't tell until he does that internal assessment. So it's going to save you a fortune in either spending a bunch of money on seed or spending a bunch of money on some of these ingredients and not knowing exactly how much you're putting down. So you're going to grow what you intend to grow. So if you plant grass and you got the right environment, you're going to be able to grow grass and not weeds. And finally, it's your sample is only as good as it's taken. So make sure you discuss with myself or somebody else how to go about taking that exact sample, because that's really key in getting the best sample, getting the best results. And then this is something that we just talked about, and I really enjoy this process. It's a free one as far as for Williamson County that we offer, and I encourage you, if you're not in Williamson County, or if you're in a different area where I'm not able to visit, to take advantage, reaching out to your extension office and talking about this, because we can talk about these presentations and talk about rehabbing your pastures and maintaining them through a lot of these seminars. But ultimately, the best way to get a specific plan for your farm is through a farm visit. We can talk a lot of generalities, and our goal is to teach you how to understand your grass, teach you how to understand what's going on so that you can help make some of those decisions. But coming up with that first plan can be difficult. And so that's where having a farm visit can really help set that up and give you an idea kind of what's your potential for your farm, what are your goals, because we can start talking about an ideal. So, and we can be really bad about this, is talking about all these ideal situations, and it just doesn't apply to what's going on your farm. So I'd rather present a farm plan that works for you versus just some generalities that talk about it. So take advantage of this and really utilize this to set your expectations so you have realistic goals. and you're not set up for constant disappointment. Because I think sometimes we do that. We set expectations for what should happen, and not necessarily take in all the factors that's going on. So as we go through here, as we kind of come to the very end here, I've kind of set up a timeline between now and our next presentation that applies a lot of this information that we have just talked about. And so this is not an exact deadline or schedule. It's more about the timing. So I would look at more about the dates between the time. So like September 13th and September 28th, that's about 15 days. So obviously, you can shift this timeline here and there, and we can talk about that specifically if you have questions, but it's just to give you an idea to be thinking about. And so what I've gone through here is put kind of a timeline of things that could be done between now and our next class. And so one is just going through that evaluation process. Two is doing a soil test that can be done at any point in time, and those nutrients can be applied at any point in time. Three, we're starting to look at spraying. And this would be if you're doing like a total renovation, you're going to use like a glyphosate to do a total termination, or you're doing some broadleaf treatments. You're looking at doing that fairly soon. You might make that first clip depending on how thick of stand of grass you're doing, or if you plan on clipping or baling. So you may need to mow twice, mow it down a height, and then come back a little bit later and mow it a little bit lower to try to keep most of that dead material off. Spraying again, potentially if you're just doing a broadleaf herbicide, or spraying for the first time. But you notice this is one of those key things. I have 15 days out. That's usually about the last time you want to spray if you plan on reseeding. And we use September 28th as a reseed date. But it's about 15 days out for most of the herbicides between when you spray, when you can go back and reseed, except glyphosate. So we'll talk about that. So clipping and baling, this is where you can mow or bale. So this is where if you're getting ready to start to reseed somewhere around the end of September, early October, you can look at clipping and baling. That's where coming through and baling all that material, taking it all off the field. And so you've exposed a lot of that dirt. If you're doing the total renovation, this is where you would use maybe another treatment of glyphosate to go ahead and kill whatever actually didn't get killed the first time. And you can actually come back in that day or the next day and plant seeds. So glyphosate, once it's in the soil, it has no effect on any type of seed. So if you're using glyphosate for a termination of all the stand, you can actually spray that and then go ahead and apply that a little bit later. So if you have an idea kind of what's the situation you're looking at, I've numbered all these across here. And so if you're doing a total redo, this is kind of where I'd say you need to do step 1, 2, 3, depending on how much you have growing. You might do step 4 and then proceed to step 7 and 8. If you're doing nothing, you might do 1, 2, 3, control some of those broadleaf weeds, or 4, just mow down some of those, whichever works for you. If you're trying to reseed and you've got a lot of really grazed down cool season grass with very few weeds, you might look at a scenario where you do 1, 2, 5, and 8. And then, or a 1, 2, 4, 8. So it just depends on what you have. And then if you look up very top where you've got a lot of warm season weeds and you've got a few weeds, so that's where you might do a 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 8. So I hope this just gives you a guideline as we're going through here. It gets conversations started, it gets you thinking. And then if you have any other questions, it's a good opportunity to follow up on that specific question. So as we've reached the end of our time for today, so we ran over a little bit, but this session, next session, those are some of the, there's a lot going on. There's a lot we're preparing for. So they typically are going to be a little bit longer. But our next meeting is September 28th. And what we're going to start looking at is selecting the right seed, preparing the ground, seeding, establishing that patience for what we've got going on, and then looking at potentially a first frost occurring before our October meeting. So right now we're kind of preparing for that time period. And the reason why I didn't get a lot into the reseeding part right now is the actual physical reseeding is like we mentioned, September can still be a pretty warm month. And when you start looking at that, I was just looking at the 10-day outlook, and there is some rain coming there, but there's also a lot of upper 80s and 90-degree temperatures. So if you get a little seedling that pops up and it's only got a little root, and all of a sudden it reverts right back to 90 degrees and it goes for 2 days and it doesn't get any rain, that seedling is going to struggle pretty good without being able to have access into that deeper water moisture. So I'm always pretty hesitant about doing a lot of reseeding in early September. But that's something that we can continue to look at. And if you've got questions, please feel free to give me a call. But at this point, I'm going to stop the recording, and then we'll have questions that you guys may have. But thank you guys for attending the August session. I hope it was helpful. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me and set up a farm visit or just ask questions along the way. So let me